Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Have you ever served jury duty? Have you ever served jury duty? I've gotten jury duty notices a couple times in my life, but I've yet to sit on a jury. And in some ways, I'm disappointed. In other ways, I suspect it wouldn't be as exciting of an adventure as I'm thinking it could be. But when I got out of law school in '91, moved back to my hometown, and almost immediately got a notice to appear for jury duty. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'll get to actually see this from the other side. And, I was still a young attorney. I thought, like I said, life is an adventure. And the card that I got in the mail said specifically, the night before your date, call the court to see if we still need you. And I called the night before and they said, no, we don't need you. There's no trials going tomorrow. So thank you very much. We can throw the card away. I'm like, kind of wanted to do it, but how that goes. So, in case you're curious, if you get the notice for jury duty, if you haven't done this yet, you'll get a notice that says, show up at the court on this date and time, and you show up, and they herd you into a room, and depends on how big the room is, as to, how many people they might have called that day, and they show you a video usually, or somebody will come in and explain to you the process of what jurors do, how important you are to our democracy, and thank you for showing up. And then they'll say, just sit tight, and when we need jurors, we'll let you know. And then what'll happen? Some courtroom will be ready to go. They need a jury, and let's suppose it's a civil case. They need 6 jurors plus 2 alternates. They need 8 jurors. They'll bring in, like, say, 20. They'll grab 20 people out of that room and send them to the courtroom. And then the judge and the 2 attorneys will ask a series of questions. It's called voir dire. We'll ask questions of the prospective jurors to find out if they are suitable for sitting and also make sure they're not disqualified for some reason. And they'll go through that process, and they'll finally decide on who's going to sit on the jury, and those people will be selected for jury duty. The other people will be excused. So it's possible that you'll get called and never quizzed. It's possible you called and quizzed but not selected, because that's what happened to me the second time. So 20 years later, I'm sitting around going, how come nobody wants me for jury duty? But 20 years later, I get the notices, come on down for jury duty. And this is actually at the circuit court. So it's a higher level court. So there's a larger pool of people. The odds of an actual jury being called, pretty good. So I go there, I go into the room with all the people, and they show the video, and we all get a little thing that says juror on it so that people know not to harass us or bother us. And as the day's going by, I'm reading People magazine and whatever other things they've got laying around for reading material. And then all of a sudden, they go, we need some jurors, listen for your name. And I hear, Stephen Lehto. I'm like, okay. So I got called to at least go and get the preliminary part done. So me and a group of other people go down to a courtroom. We get seated where the spectators sit. And the judge comes out, and the parties come out, the attorneys come out, and the judge explains a little more about what's going to happen. Ask you some questions, and you're sworn to tell the truth and all that. And then they start asking questions, and the first ones are obvious. Does anybody here know either party? Does anybody here have a reason they couldn't sit on a jury for a couple days? And then we discovered the trial's gonna be about, I think they said, a week long. Is there anybody here who cannot be here for the full week? That kind of thing. And no major problems there. And they said, okay, now the judges, I'm gonna let the attorneys ask you guys some questions, and then based on that, they'll decide who's gonna stay on the jury. And so they went down the aisle, and they get to me, and they go, okay, what do you, what's your name? What do you do? I said, my name's Steve Lehto. I'm a lawyer and I'm a writer. And somebody goes, what kind of law do you practice? And now we'd heard that this is a car accident case. One of the first things they told us, they said it's a car accident case. And from what I gathered, somebody changed lanes and 2 cars hit. And each driver thinks the other person was at fault. So it's not the kind of case I actually wanted to sit for, but I'm here. So I said, and they go, I said, well, I do exclusively consumer protection work. I go, I've never handled a personal injury case. I've never handled a car accident case. I don't do that. All I do is consumer protection. And it was almost like an afterthought, but one of the lawyers said, oh, what do you write? And I said, well, I write nonfiction, local history, car books. The guy goes, oh, okay. And somebody, I forgot which one, asked me a question, something about, I forgot what the question was, but I felt that to be truthful, I had to say, by the way, I also taught law school. I taught law school for 10 years. And I always wondered if either of them had known that, if that would have helped get me kicked off the jury, because all I'd be doing the entire trial is critiquing the attorneys in my head, thinking, hey, that person's doing that wrong. That attorney's doing that wrong. But anyways, at the end of the selection, The judge and the attorneys conferred, and they came up with 8 names. And they said, okay, the following 8 people are on the jury, and guy on this side gets called, guy on this side gets called. I don't get selected. I'm not on the jury. So they actually said if you were not selected, there's enough people here, you can actually go home. So you can go back to the clerk's window, fill out a little form. They'll mail you a check for, I think, $6. And the funny thing is, the person in front of me filled out the form and handed it over. And the woman said, okay, we'll mail you your check. And the person in front of me is like, a check? I want my money now. And I'm thinking to myself, $6? You don't do this for a living, okay? You just take the money because it's free, but it's barely even worth standing in time, standing in line for. But that's my close call with jury duty, and since then haven't been called again, and so far have not sat on a jury. Now I can tell you that I know people who've sat on many juries, including I've got a brother who's been, I think, seated and actually got to rule on 3 different cases, and every time I talk to him, I'm like, have you been called again? And it seems like every time I talk to him, he has been. It's crazy. But the funny thing is, he's got some great stories about different things that have happened to him during the jury selection process. And one of the cases, I don't think he got called to sit on this jury, but he was in a group of people that were being quizzed to voir dire to see if they were going to be seated. And somebody asked the jury panel, potential jurors, does anybody here know the parties? Does anybody know the attorneys? And a hand went up. And the judge said, oh, who do you know? And the attorney for the defendant was an extremely high-profile attorney here in Michigan, whose name anybody who watches the news would know, and who would probably recognize the person also because he was recognizable. And the juror said, the defense attorney, he's the guy who always represents guilty people. And of course, a brouhaha ensued, and I believe that person didn't get seated nor selected, but they didn't disqualify the whole pool. And I was kind of surprised by that. And I asked my brother. I said, wait, you're telling me that the judge let you guys continue with the selection process? And he said, well, the judge basically read that person the riot act and then instructed us all to ignore that statement because obviously it was inflammatory on some level. That's the guy who always defends the guilty people. I also know somebody else who's been called quite a few times for jury duty. And this is, again, like I don't understand. Because many of the potential jurors, are selected from voting rolls. That's my understanding. So they go over the list of registered voters, and they, since they got your name and your address, they send you hey, come on down for jury duty. And like I said, I've been called twice in 27, 28 years, and I'm not even counting before law school. I was never called then either. But I know somebody who lives in a part of the state where it snows quite a bit, and they measure the snow by feet, not inches. And he got called several times, and he just kept getting called over and over again. And one time he got called, and it says, show up for court on this date and potential jury duty, And he gets up that morning, and a bunch of snow has fallen. And he gets in his vehicle, and he's driving, and sure enough, everywhere he's going, the roads are chaos. Cars in the ditches, cars upside down, spun around, wreckers everywhere, police everywhere, intersections jammed up. And he manages to get to court 15 minutes late. And he walks in the door of the court, and he goes and finds the clerk, and the clerk is writing something as he approaches. And she goes, can I help you? And he goes, yeah, I'm here for jury duty. I'm a few minutes late. She goes, what's your name? And he tells her, and she goes, oh, I was just filling out the warrant for your arrest. And she goes, but since you're here, we'll ignore it this time. And he's like, did you know it was snowing outside? Did you see the traffic? Do you understand that sometimes people can be a few minutes late for a good reason? And she said, well, we as a matter of routine issue bench warrants for the arrest of anyone who doesn't show up for jury duty. And she goes, and I've got a whole stack here to fill out. Now, some of those people may have skipped it that day, but as my acquaintance pointed out, there were probably a bunch of them who would show up right after he did. But they literally don't even wait more than 15 minutes before they start filling out the bench warrants for arrest. So my friend who had that happen to him, when he got excused from jury duty that day, he went back to that window and said, I'm curious, where do you get your names for jury duty from? And she said several sources, but one of them is off the voting rolls. And he said, oh, okay. And he walked to the other part of the building where you register to vote and said, I would like to unregister my voting rights. And the clerk said, why? And he goes, do I need a reason? And she's like, I guess not, but no one does that. And he goes, no, I want to do that. He goes, I want to unregister to vote. I'm sick and tired of being called for jury duty. And the fact that they were actually filling out the warrant for my arrest when I was 15 minutes late on a day like today. So he goes, I want to unregister to vote. And he did that. I don't blame him, by the way. So, it's crazy. One of the things that most courts understand is that jurors generally don't want to be there, but they also generally respect the fact that, hey, if I needed a jury, I would hope people would show up for it. So it's part of one of those things that you just put up with because it's what you get. It's part of the job. It's part of the duty. It's part of the overall equation. Someday you might need a jury, so you sit on yours. Okay. So if you get called, most people understand it. So courts generally are extremely respectful of jurors and potential jurors. When I went in the day that I didn't get selected, but I got to go through the process, I was treated extremely well. Everybody is polite. And they act almost like they're being extremely good hosts to important VIP guests. That's how I was treated. Okay, I'd probably feel differently if I'd seen a bench warrant for my arrest being filled out because I was seemingly, I would think, a few minutes late, but for a good reason. Seriously, even in a situation in an area where it snows a lot and you expect it, it's always possible. You can be a few minutes late. You might be the person in the ditch. You might be the person who's stuck behind the closed intersection, and there might not be another way around that makes sense. So, I don't blame my friend for unregistering to vote to get out of the system after that. And I forgot how many times he'd been called, but he'd been called like 3 or 4 times in a very short period of time. And I remember him calling me and saying, I don't understand. Why do I keep getting called? And it's a different county than the one I live in. So I said, I don't know. But again, my brother, the one who's sat on several juries and been called for even more, he lives in the same county I lived in for decades. He gets called all the time. I never got called except for the one time, and that was in a district court. And he keeps getting called for circuit court. So again, it's part of the magic that is our legal system. And finally, I have to tell you, I did a podcast recently on jury nullification, and I mentioned that after the jury renders its verdict, either side or the judge can just decide as a matter of routine to ask the jurors one by one, was that and is that your verdict? And they call it polling the jury. And if it's a unanimous verdict, they've all got to say, yes, that was my verdict. Yes, that is my verdict, and it was my verdict. But in a civil case where you don't need to win unanimously, it's always interesting to poll the jury because if you have 6 members of the jury, but you only need 4 of them to win, you could win the trial by 4-2 or 5-1 or 6-0. And that's always the question. And I'm not going to get too heavily into the facts of the case, but I had a case where there was a huge amount of contest, let's say, between my primary witness and the other side's primary witness. And I, of course, believed my guy, and I assumed they believed their guy. And, of course, the case came down to which of those 2 people was the jury going to believe. And after the trial was over and we lost the trial, I asked the judge, could you please poll the jury? And was it your verdict? He goes, yes, 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 no. And the last person yelled and said, no! Like that. And I always respected that because the person could have said no. But the person was trying to make a point. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, as they say, in the deliberation room to hear those deliberations going down, because I suspect that those were heated as well. So the question is, have you ever served on jury duty? If so, put it in the comments below. I love hearing the stories. I've gotten a few in response to my jury nullification video, which is what made me think of it today. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.